Screening for arrogance is a well-known trick in the HR world. And if you think about it, no candidates want to show as arrogant in a job interview, yet it does happen for someone to be arrogant. And when this happens in a smaller team, this basically has a good chance of ruining that team. So needless to say, this is a very important aspect of a job interview that you might not be aware of coming up as a candidate. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about 6 methods, 6 ways that you might come across as arrogant in a job interview. And the first one is also one there's a lot of misconceptions around, the I versus we. Should you say I did versus we did? And the simple answer is say we as much as possible, because this way you'll show up as a team player. And when you say I, you risk coming across as an arrogant, as an individualist in this job interview. And let me first explain the whole thing with I versus we, because I know many of you have been reading articles online that encouraging you to say I, not we. The problem with this comes for junior roles, because junior roles want to take a lot more responsibility than they actually had for a specific project. So that's why, they would be encouraged to say, I did this. Because, if you say we all the time, it's very hard for an interviewer to screen, to understand whether you did all the project or not. But in fact, for the vast majority of you who are not applying for junior roles, it will actually play to your advantage almost always. Even if they would have any doubts that you worked on that specific project, that you took the whole responsibility for it, they could simply ask you a follow-up question and it would be problem solved. But just one more note on this I versus we. At Salesforce, they specifically screen you for how often do you say I versus how often do you say we. And it's actually a qualification criteria. In other words, if you say too often I, they will disqualify you for the job. It's as simple as that. And there's articles online sharing exactly about this behavior. The second method someone might come across as arrogant would be while answering to the question, what's your weakness? And a reactive approach to this would be, if you haven't prepared or if you don't care too much about this, would say, hey, I work too much. Right? So so you say that you work too much applying for a job that's eventually gonna get you 200,000 a year. So needless to say, turning a positive into a negative is not something you would want to do. So when getting asked these questions, such as tell me about your weakness, try to find a genuine weakness, one that's really true in yours for your specific candidate profile. The third method here is to simply dodge failure questions. So actually, if you don't prepare for failure questions and you're not used with behavioral interviewing, is the more likely approach that you will dodge the failure stories. Simple words, you will not talk about real failures, or you will avoid talking about the proper failures that you had in your career. So I believe this is it's a very dangerous approach if you don't prepare failure stories for a job interview, for a behavioral job interview nowadays. So there you go. You should know that dodging failure questions might also come across as an arrogant behavior. Next criteria that you should be aware of is if you forget to prepare questions for them. And you might ask, okay, but so what if I don't ask? I could come up with some questions for them during the interview. And it might work in the case of a telephone screen, because there's only one interviewer. But if you are scaling this to 5 or more interviewers, chances are your questions will not sound as good as you might think, or even worse, you would say, hey, I haven't prepared anything, I don't have any questions. So interviewers are trained to screen for people who are genuinely interested in the role, and not only that, but there are also candidates that are also self-critical. They really want to know if this job is the right fit for them. So this is why you should take these questions for the interviewers seriously. Number 5, when impressing becomes distressing. So this usually happens with people that have exceptional CVs and they expect the interviewing process to be only a formality. And even worse, they start arguing with the interviewer subtly, not openly, but they also might subtly be critical of the company that they're applying for. And this is the toxic formula to show arrogance here. Now, an interesting piece of advice that I heard is that one way to overcome this type of behavior would be to, whenever you're listening to what the interviewer has to say, you must listen to learn, not listen to respond, not listen to be reactive to their question. And if you employ such an approach, you will your leadership style would come across as a lot more transformational as opposed to transactional. So this is one way you would want to mitigate these possible arrogance within your behavior simply because of the fact you're a subject matter expert. And the last method to screen for arrogance in a job interview is actually a job interview question. What would you change about your previous employer? And the questionable approach, the questionable answers to such a question would be from candidates immediately highlighting their their unfavorable working environment in their previous role. So, to exaggerate here, I'm sick and tired of my previous boss that always took credit for my work, even if I was working very, very hard and long hours. It was only them who eventually got promoted. Of course, this is an exaggeration, but it's a lot easier than you think to put the blame on someone else. So the ideal, there's no ideal answer when it comes to answering such a question, but you should employ a realistic approach. Like in any role, there are pros and there are cons. And when talking about the cons, you must avoid at all costs being overly negative. Negativity is something that might also trigger arrogance to a certain extent, but you should avoid at all costs putting the blame on anyone during a job interview. So these would be the 6 areas, the 6 behaviors that I identified to be relevant when spotting about arrogance in a job interview. So hopefully at least some of this information help you to further tune up your answers and essentially to pay more attention with these things in your job interviews.